Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Chatham House. I'm Robin Niblett, Director of the Institute, and we're delighted to welcome back to Chatham House the Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, who will be discussing with us today what do the alternatives to EU membership look like. An important speech, obviously, at a time of an important debate, and from a Chatham House perspective, we were obviously delighted to have the Prime Minister with us back on the 10th of November of last year when he laid out the government's negotiating position on the same day that the letter was sent to the President of the Council, President Tusk. And since that time, we've had a number of debates here and sets of comments, including from Hilary Benn, giving a Labour Party view on the EU. We've had the former Chancellor, Lord Lawson, speaking here with a different viewpoint just the other week. And I think it's both appropriate and timely as the government is coming forward with its views of the best choice for the UK, that we would hear from Philip Hammond right now to laying out the position on the alternatives to EU membership. Philip Hammond obviously doesn't need any introduction to you here, but I would note that prior to being Foreign Secretary, he was Secretary of Defence, Secretary of State for Transport as well. So somebody with extensive positions across government, and I'm sure drawing on all of those different experiences in his current role in the referendum campaign. Foreign Secretary, we're delighted you come and join us today. Just to let everyone know, we will be engaging in questions and some discussion with our members after his remarks. This is obviously on the record. Thank you very much and welcome back to Chatham House.
Well, thank you, Robin, for that introduction. In just 16 weeks' time, Britain will face a decision that will shape the course of our nation's history for a generation or more. Should we remain within the European Union on the terms negotiated by David Cameron, or should we withdraw from membership and go it alone? The government's clear view is that we are stronger, safer, and better off remaining in a reformed European Union. Stronger because our global influence is enhanced by being a leading member of the world's largest trading bloc. Safer because of the work we do together with EU partners to strengthen our defences against organised crime and terrorism. And better off because of our access to a market of 500 million consumers. The deal that the Prime Minister won in Brussels 12 days ago ensures that the UK can remain in the EU with a special status, outside the euro, outside Schengen, with an opt-in on justice and home affairs matters, an exemption from ever closer union, and a new mechanism to limit access to our benefits system for EU migrants. That deal protects British jobs by ensuring a level playing field in Europe for British business, safeguarding the pound and the Bank of England. It will boost EU competitiveness by completing the single market, prioritising international trade agreements, and cutting the burden of EU regulation. And it provides an emergency brake to limit access to our benefit system for EU migrants and gives us new powers to exclude criminals and to stop exporting child benefits at UK rates. I think that's a good deal for Britain. And as the British people decide whether to take it and remain in a reformed European Union, offering Britain the best of both worlds, or to take a leap into the unknown, I want today to try to shine some light on what a future outside the EU might look like for Britain, because the Leave campaign have so far failed to do so. On Monday, we published a paper setting out the process by which we would exit the EU following a Leave vote. Today, we're publishing a paper outlining the principal alternatives to membership. I'm laying that paper in Parliament this morning, and it will be available online. But I now want to summarise our main findings. But first, I want to be clear about the process of negotiating an exit and our future relationship with the EU, because it would become the defining national project for several years. A vote to leave on June the 23rd would trigger a 2-year window under the terms of the treaties for the UK to negotiate the terms of our exit from the EU. And in the meantime, we will be able to offer British businesses no assurance at all about their future access to the EU, or for that matter, to other markets. We will have nothing to say to American, Japanese, Chinese companies looking for a base in which to invest to supply the EU market. Our economy would literally be on hold whilst our competitors, including our European competitors, forge ahead. And at the end of 2 years, there is no guarantee at all that we would have reached agreement, but our exit would be automatic unless every single member of the remaining European Union agreed to an extension. Our access to the single market would cease, our trading agreements with more than 50 countries around the world would lapse, with an immediate and negative effect on confidence, on growth, on investments, and on jobs. Years of uncertainty for Britain, just as we're getting back on our feet. And like any divorce, the negotiations with our former EU partners would be likely to be difficult. The leaders of the remaining member states would have their own pressing domestic political calculations to consider. In many cases, people in their countries already think that they've gone the extra mile for Britain. They'd be frustrated that having done that to offer Britain a special and unique status in the EU, their efforts had been in vain. And frankly, they'd be apprehensive as well, apprehensive of the contagion that a Brexit might bring to their own countries. So let's be clear. If we reject the special status the Prime Minister's painstakingly negotiated, then we can expect the goodwill that we've seen towards Britain during these negotiations to evaporate pretty quickly. And the blunt fact is that our former partners in Europe will not feel that they owe us any favours. They will have no interest in helping us to thrive outside the EU. And to those who argue, as some have done, that they need us more than we need them, I say, sadly, not the case. Even if the only factor was trade, and it certainly isn't, the fact is that in 2014, half of the goods Britain exported went to the EU, half. But just 7% of the goods that the EU exported came to the UK. Our exit negotiation and our attempts to forge some sort of new relationship are likely to involve some very tough and very protracted discussions. So what realistically are the alternatives? At different times, the various Leave campaigns have suggested over 20 different models to choose from, including the current EU deals with Norway, Switzerland, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Canada, Turkey, Korea, Macedonia, even Peru and Vanuatu. But they have been unable to settle on one. In fact, they've deliberately avoided trying because they cannot point to an example which is better than the special status within the EU that we now have on offer. Every other option has significant drawbacks. And the simple truth is that we cannot know what deal a Britain outside the EU would end up with. The evidence, however, and that's what this paper is about today, the evidence suggests that there are three basic models. I'll call them the Norway model, the bilateral model, a negotiated bilateral agreement such as the free trade deals used by Switzerland, Canada, Korea, and Turkey, or as a default, the WTO, World Trade Organization model. Let me deal with each in turn. Norway, along with Iceland and Liechtenstein, is a member of the European Economic Area, but not the EU. And Norway is the non-EU country with the greatest, although still not total, access to the European single market. It does have the same access in services as the UK has now, but it is outside the customs union, meaning that all trade in goods between the EU and Norway is subject to customs checks and rules of origin. And it faces tariffs in agriculture and fish. Norway does also take part in some areas of non-economic cooperation, like counter-terrorism, but it pays a price for these privileges. It has to adopt most EU rules without any say in making them. It pays roughly the same into the EU per person as the UK does. And crucially, it is obliged to accept the free movement of people from both EU and EEA countries. Migrants in Norway have the same right to access benefits as Norwegians. Today, there is a higher proportion of EU nationals resident in Norway than there is in the UK. The case of Norway neatly demonstrates the dilemma for leave. The price of access to the single market is freedom of movement. And the more access to the market they promise, the more empty the boast that they would be able unilaterally to control migration from the EU. And I say this, if we care about real sovereignty, about being able to shape the decisions which affect us, then the Norway model is definitely not for us. What if we were to make a bilateral agreement? After all, the EU has a broad range of trade agreements with other countries, such as Switzerland, Turkey, or Canada. Some have recommended the Swiss model, but it's taken Switzerland 2 decades to negotiate more than 100 separate agreements that it currently has with the EU. Even then, they only have partial access to the single market. They face barriers for agriculture and, crucially, from our point of view, for services. Once again, they are bound by the principle of free movement of people, with almost 4 times as many resident EU nationals per capita in Switzerland as in the UK. Others point to Turkey as a model to follow. Now, Turkey, of course, is a candidate country for membership of the EU and has been in a customs union with the EU since 1995. It has full access to the single market for industrial and processed agricultural goods, where it is subject to the full application of EU regulations. But it has no access for raw agricultural products, nor, again, crucially, for services. As part of the customs union, Turkey must align its external tariffs with the EU, and when the EU signs a trade deal with a third country, Turkey must open its market on the same terms, but this is not reciprocal, and the third country is not obliged to open its market to Turkish exports. Turkey doesn't take part in policing and criminal justice measures, has only limited cooperation on international security, and of course has no say in EU decision-making. And our conclusion is that the Turkish model would clearly not work for Britain. But what about Canada? The EU-Canada deal has taken 7 years and counting to finalise and has still not yet been approved by the European Parliament. But when it happens, and it will happen, it will be the most extensive bilateral agreement the EU has ever made. It gives market access without the free movement of people and without paying into the EU budget. But Canada is not a European country. And let's be clear, the Canadian trade deal does not even remotely replicate the access we have as an EU member. Canadian manufacturers will only have tariff-free access if they meet EU rules of origin. So Canadian products like cars with complex international supply chains may still face tariffs. Canadian financial services providers can't supply directly to the EU market. They have to set up subsidiaries inside EU member states operating under EU regulations, exporting Canadian jobs. This would really matter for Britain. Our services sector is 4/5, 80% of our economy. We're the second largest exporter of services in the world after the United States, and the EU is our largest market for those services. The EU also sets regulatory standards on many products, cars, pharmaceuticals, toys, foodstuffs, and Canada will not have any say over any of them. So the fact is, none of the bilateral free trade models would offer anything like the access that we now have to the single market. And many of them would require adoption of EU regulations and freedom of movement rules. What about Britain's trade with the rest of the world? We currently benefit from EU trade deals with over 50 different countries. And these deals have been based on the negotiating muscle of a bloc with 500 million consumers and a quarter of the world's GDP. Renegotiating them as a single country would take many, many years. Years in which British businesses would be squeezed out of traditional markets and with no guarantee at the end of the process that we could get terms as good as we have now. Some have said we should focus our attention on deals with the Anglosphere and the Commonwealth, but the EU already has or is negotiating trade deals with all the biggest Commonwealth countries, and none of our allies wants us to leave the EU. Not Australia, not New Zealand, not Canada, not the United States. In fact, the only country, if the truth is told, that would like us to leave the EU is Russia. And that should probably tell us all that we need to know. Let's look for a moment now at the default option, the World Trade Organization rules, which is where we will end up if we leave the EU without a deal agreed. For anyone who wants to ensure a clean break with the EU, the WTO is the only honest model. WTO rules mean we could sell into the single market, but at a price. The EU imposes a common external tariff on goods and services from countries outside the EU who don't have free trade deals agreed. 10% on cars, 30% on confectionery, 36% on dairy produce. Our exports would cost more and so be less competitive. That will cost British jobs. And if we reciprocated, our imports would cost more too, meaning higher prices in our shops. And that would not be all. Under WTO rules, we couldn't differentiate between countries. So, for example, if we decided to allow Irish goods to enter the UK tariff-free, we would have to do the same for all 160 countries in the WTO, putting British jobs at risk from foreign competition. Because as EU members, the common external tariffs protect our industries from undercutting from outside the EU, while allowing us to import from Europe without tariffs pushing up costs. Outside the EU, it would be all or nothing under WTO rules. And for our crucial services sector, without a preferential trade agreement, UK businesses would only be guaranteed access under the General Agreement on Trade in Services. This is a much more basic framework, providing much less access to markets. So on even a cursory inspection, the WTO model does not deliver for Britain. It will be bad for business, bad for jobs, bad for growth. So bad for Britain. The truth is, the Leave campaigns cannot point to a credible alternative. They're unable or unwilling to address their core dilemma. The price for any significant level of access to the single market for goods, let alone services, is acceptance of free movement of people. The EU has been remarkably consistent in its dealings with other European countries. And the more access to the single market the Leave campaign promises, the more hollow their pledge to limit EU migration. So what should we conclude from this analysis? That none of the post-exit options offer anything close to the best of both worlds special status deal that the Prime Minister has negotiated for us in the European Union. And the most often cited model, Norway, would offer us quite literally the worst of both worlds. Paying as if we remained a member of the European Union, subject to the rules of the European Union, and obliged to observe the principle of freedom of movement to obtain access to the single market that we have now, but without any say over how those rules are made and without any say over how the European Union is run. Negotiating any kind of arrangement with 27 countries that we have just rejected will almost certainly take years, will not give full access to the single market without contributing to the budget, accepting the rules, allowing free movement, and will leave us with no seat at the table. To me, that's less sovereignty, not more sovereignty. Balancing the burdens and the benefits, none of the options that are remotely likely to be deliverable comes close to matching the deal that we already have on the table. So why would we take a leap in the dark? Why would we risk the effect of years of uncertainty on the British economy? Why would we take that chance with our children's future, risking our influence, our prosperity, and our security, when by voting to remain, we can have the best of both worlds in a reformed EU rather than the worst of both outside? A powerful voice inside Europe instead of a lonely voice outside. A Great Britain, stronger, safer, and better off within the EU. Thank you.